Hello and welcome to And Did Those Feet, the podcast that glories in the 25 years of English football after the Second World War, from 1945, the end of the war, to 1970, and the elimination of England, humiliation, one might say, of England in from the 1970 World Cup at the hands of West Germany. And joining me, as always, is Karl Hemsley. Hello, Karl.
Hi, Peter.
Carl, we were talking about the greatest managers of the 1940s and 50s, the most prominent being Busby of Manchester United and Cullis of Wolves. Both, of course, distinguished former players. Busby captained Scotland, Cullis captained England. But they made their names perhaps more emphatically as managers, and they come down to us now more as managers. Which other ones did we talk about? Which other managers from prominent from the 1950s did we talk about last time?
Well, there were a few. I think we agreed probably the next most successful in terms of winning competitions was Tom Whittaker, the Arsenal manager. Um, and then there were others who had successes, but had a lot of influence tactically. So Arthur Rowe at Tottenham, and he he seemed to, as you were talking about how he seemed to line a line of succession of people who had a great influence on the way the game's played. His famous push and run style at Spurs um, had was very influential. There was George Rayner, who stands out because of having success abroad by managing the Swedish national team. And then very interesting character, Vic Buckingham, won the cup with West Brom, but probably through his career, more importantly, was extremely influential in contributing to the development of total football. He ended up managing both Barcelona and Ajax. Um, and then also there was a person who I was very keen to talk about, who wasn't really a club manager at all, except on a temporary basis, and that's Jimmy Murphy, who was Matt Busby's assistant at Manchester United, and um, and Murphy, apart from being very influential in developing the team that became known as the Busby Babes, had a spell when he was in charge of the side following the Munich air disaster. And and Murphy had the quite remarkable achievement, really, of cobbling a side together in the most difficult circumstances imagiable,
And took them to the
putting
FA Cup
together.
final.
Absolutely,
I mean,
yes.
a real
So
scratch side. He got them to the 58 Cup final, which of course they lost, all at the same time while preparing Wales for their only appearance, I think I'm right in saying, in the World Cup finals, at least until recent years, in
yeah,
1958. And of course, they did very well. They reached the quarterfinals, I think. And so one thing
yeah,
that strikes me about that list is that so I mentioned earlier, Busby had captained Scotland and Cullen had captained England. Actually, the others are not that distinguished footballers. Whittaker, for example, had a few games for Arsenal. I think he may have had about 60 games for Arsenal, but really at Arsenal he was more the physiotherapist who got promoted. And
that's
others that
right.
you mentioned, Arthur Rowe. I think Arthur Rowe may have had one cap for England, and I think Vic Buckingham may have had something similar. But these were not headline-making footballers. And I mean, George Rayner, famously, although he was a very distinguished manager abroad, took Sweden to the World Cup final in 1958. Nevertheless, George Rayner really had a very ordinary career in the 30s for Mansfield, Rotherham, and so forth. And it's a reminder, I think, of an interesting fact about managers. The best managers aren't always the best players, or let's put it the other way around. The best players aren't always the best managers. And we were
Mm.
talking earlier in the week about you and I about the last England international. So we'll put this out to our viewer and see if he or she can
Mm.
identify who we're talking about here, which is the last England international to win either the First Division or the Premier League as manager. So we're asking a question, do top players translate into being top managers, or are top managers always invariably top players? We're thinking about that sort of show us your medals mentality. It seems
Mm.
in many ways, I mean, from the people we've been talking about, if anyone had said to George Rayner, show us your medals, he would have been at a loss. But I mean, a World Cup final is speaks for itself, in my opinion. Those are interesting. And another question I've got for you, Carl, which is this one for later in the show, which is it seems to me that the
Yeah.
top managers often have uh, the biggest purses. And there's no coincidence, of course. But I thought, was that always the case? And so the question I'm going to ask you is, in the years between 1945 and 1960, which I guess are the years we're covering here,
Yeah.
which managers had the most recourse to big purses? Which managers broke, so this is my specific question, which managers broke the record for spending most often? And I'm looking for two names here of two characters, both
Ooh.
managers in the English Football League, who broke the record for for large transfer fees over during the period we're talking about from 1945 to 1960. And so that's one for you to think about. It might be quite a tough one, but nevertheless, we'll come back to it.
It's a
Now, Carl, we're going to catch up on a few. We talked about Jimmy Murphy and his incredible achievement in getting Manchester United to the FA Cup final in 1958, in spite of what had happened at Munich, and Wales to the 1958 World Cup finals and into the last eight, despite losing John Charles along the way. By the way, they didn't have John Charles. They went out to Brazil,
That's
the
right.
eventual winners in '58, but they didn't have the benefit of John Charles, who was then one of the best footballers in the world, the Gareth Bale of his time. But who else are we going to talk about now? We're just going to catch up on a few managers we might have missed out on in our last chat. Who are we talking about today?
Well, one person that strikes me is Les McDowell, who was the manager of Manchester City. In fact, he to this day is the longest reigning manager of Manchester City. Again, City fans may very well remember him, but he's, he's not the best known manager around today if people were looking back on this era. Um, he played for Manchester City, took over as manager when they were in the second division in 1950. He got them promoted, didn't pull up trees initially in the first division, but sort of established them, but then had success in the Cups because he got City to the FA Cup final in 1955 when they lost, and then returned the following season to Wembley and they won the Cup in one of the most famous finals, one that was made especially famous by Bert Trautmann breaking his neck. Um, and I think one of the reasons for wanting to talk about him was his tactical innovations. He was somebody maybe a little bit like Vic Buckingham, perhaps, he was influenced by the way Hungary played. He wanted a more modern style of football, and he implemented the Reeve plan. Reeve, as in Don Reeve, by playing him as a nominally in a playmaker role, in the way that in a very similar way to Hungary played. So I think McDowell's worth a mention because of the way that he introduced this more modern way of playing, despite apparently at the time getting a fair bit of criticism from lots of City supporters who weren't keen on these innovations, but he won them over.
I can
So
imagine that
in terms of
managing.
trophies, it was only that one FA Cup.
Yes, he just gets the one. He gets the one cup.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, I think that any manager who ends up with Don Revie in his team probably has got an excellent player, but also a bit of a barrack room lawyer. And I suspect Les McDowell deserves a bit of a medal for just coping with Don Revie. In fact, I have read this somewhere that Don Revie in the 1956 Cup final, that Les McDowell gave his instructions to the team just before they went out to perform, and Don Revie, as soon as the boys got out on the pitch, Don Revie got them into a circle and said, "Right, forget all that. This is what we're going to do." And he instructed them in
Really?
how the deep lying centre forward is going to work. But clearly, I mean, if you watch the '56, and you can see it on YouTube, if you watch the '56 Cup final, one of the most striking features of it is the way that Don Revie appears to boss the midfield, and extraordinary, really, to think
Right.
he was a late recruit to that team. He was only playing in that team because of an injury elsewhere. And but of course he was nevertheless a distinguished player and uh, an England international who won the league. He's not the answer to our question, but he could have been
Yeah.
an England international who, as a manager, won the league. And clearly, I mean, one of the all-time great managers. So so he goes into our mix and so does Les McDowell. And I want to add a name to that, and that's Joe Smith, another man who won the
Mm.
cup without really, he didn't end up with a whole shelf full of medals as far as being manager concerned, but he did have a really interesting backstory. So Joe Smith is manager for Blackpool, and Blackpool are quite a prominent team in these years, partly because they've got two outstanding players in Stan Mortensen and Stan Matthews, but also because I think there's a British Army base in is Blackpool just after the war, and I think they get huge crowds because the soldiers want to go and watch them. And so they're continually, you sort of really they're sort of I
Mm.
suppose now a second division side in many ways, but in these times we're talking about they were a first division side and they had a first division manager, and that was Joe Smith. And Joe Smith had his own impeccable pedigree going back some 20 or 30 years because he had previously been the best player, that really the sort of iconic player of Bolton Wanderers in the 1920s, and had played, among other things, in the 1923 Cup final, the White Horse Cup final, which was the first Cup final to take place at Wembley. And he'd been really the top player for Bolton in those years. I know all this partly because my grandfather was from Bolton and he was a great fan of the 1923 side. Joe Smith would have been one of his heroes. Centre forward, 449 matches for Bolton Wanderers and scores 254 goals. So he's scoring over a goal every other game. I regard him as being similar to the sort of Alan Shearer of his day in terms of his effect on Bolton. And by the way, what a string of players of centre forwards Bolton produced! Because if you think that Nat Lofthouse is a Bolton lad, and subsequently a great England centre forward, and so of course was remind me
Oh,
Chelsea centre forwards
Tommy
Tommy
Lawton.
Lawton. That's the one.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so they really did produce their centre forwards. But where he comes into the story now is that, as luck would have it, he's manager of Blackpool. He gets them to the 1953 FA Cup final. He gets them to the 48 Cup final. They lose to Manchester United famously. He gets them to the 1951 Cup final. They lose to Newcastle famously. But in 53, everybody thinks that Matthews' name is on the cup, Blackpool's name is on the cup. And so it proves. And so Joe Smith,
Mm.
but the irony of all this is that Joe Smith ends up taking on with Matthews and Blackpool. It ends up taking on the team with which his name is synonymous, namely Bolton Wanderers. And so he really is a bit like Alan Shearer taking a team to Wembley only to meet Newcastle United in the final, or Eric Cantona to meet
Managing
Manchester
Middlesbrough to
United in
beat
the final.
Newcastle.
There's
Yes.
it's an extraordinary coincidence, if you like. But of course, famously, Joe Smith wins, and it means that Joe Smith has a remarkable record, if you like, of having taken part in the 1923 Cup final, the White Horse Cup final, and the 1953 Cup final, the Matthews final, two of the, if not the most iconic Cup finals in the 20th century. So a really sort of fascinating story, rather than, I wouldn't say necessarily the greatest manager of all time, though clearly he had his moments,
Yes.
but undoubtedly at the same time, fantastic story. So had
It
to
is quite
mention
something to be involved in so heavily in both of those finals, which are, as you said, they're as iconic as any.
they are. They are. Who do you want to talk about now?
Um, well, the other person I thought was worth a mention was Harry Potts,
Harry Potts, amazing.
and he's again somebody maybe not all that well remembered, apart from at the club that he managed. But Harry Potts was the manager of Burnley. He'd played for Burnley as a player, and then joined them as manager in the late 50s. Again, a manager who was influenced by some of the modern thinking going around at the time. Again, probably the Hungarians influenced him. They played Burnley under him played a version, you might say, of total football, being slightly anachronistic with the use of the term. Built around the two Jimmies in midfield, Jimmy Adamson and Jimmy McElroy. But I think the thing that's really amazing about Potts is that his success was at Burnley. And I think perhaps the most telling illustration of how well he did as manager is the fact that in 1959, in January 59, he bought a young fullback from the League of Ireland, bought a 17-year-old fullback by the name of Alex Elder. So hardly a huge signing. That was the last time that Burnley were to pay a transfer fee for eight seasons. That's the measure of what he was up against in terms of not having money to spend. But he got a side there that played extremely attractive football, won the league in 1960. A couple of seasons later was runner-up in the league and in the FA Cup. So considering some of the other clubs that he was up against and the lack of resources that he had as Burnley manager, I think he's definitely somebody who's worth a mention.
Yeah, I think you're right. But he played very attractive football, apparently. And of course, it's a very small town, Burnley. It's said to be the smallest town. Routinely, it's the smallest town with a Premier League club. And of course, that's some achievement. With bearing in mind that we're talking about a town here. I think of something under 100,000.
I think it's
So
something like that. Yeah.
they've been prominent for many, many years in a big football town, no doubt about that. And Harry Potts apparently did play beautiful football. And as you say, they were all players who, in the Manchester United model, the Manchester United model that's made famous by Busby, they're really brought up through the club. It's not a team made on the transfer list or in the transfer system. So, well, he's an interesting. And I think we're getting a picture here of football in the 50s, of its relationship to money, its relationship to society, its relationship to the town in which these clubs are prominent. And on a similar lines, really, I'd like to just mention Billy Walker, who's a little bit like Joe Smith in a way. He's an Aston Villa man before the war. He makes his debut for Villa straight after the First World War, a little bit like Joe Smith. Remember, Joe Smith played in the cup final in 1923. Well, Billy Walker plays in the cup final of 1920, and he's playing for Aston Villa. So it's his first season. He's a cup winner, and he ends up playing over 500 games for Aston Villa in the 20s and 30s, and scores 244 goals. So he's a prolific goal scorer. Again, not unlike Joe Smith. He's a sort of one goal every two games sort of character, which I think is the record of most top goal scorers. People like Michael Owen, for example, are going at a goal every two games. Harry Kane might be a bit higher than that, but Harry Kane set standards that most can't meet. But certainly, if we can talk about the average excellent striker, it's a goal every other game, and Billy Walker is doing that. He retires in 1934, and in 1935, amazingly, so he's appointed manager of Sheffield Wednesday, and in 1935 he wins the FA Cup in his first season. So he's played in an FA Cup final. He's won the FA Cup as a player, and in 1935, his first season. So he wins the cup in his first season as a player and in his first season as a manager. And really, that's an extraordinary accomplishment. But it gets better because now, 25 years later, I think it's 24 years later, Billy Walker is manager of Nottingham Forest, and 24 years after he first wins the cup with Sheffield Wednesday, 1935. So by now we're Nottingham Forest in 1959, and 24 years have passed, and an awful lot of water, an awful lot of tactical water has gone under the bridge since 1935. Billy Walker wins the cup again, the longest stretch of between two cup triumphs for any manager. I think I'm right in saying on record. So 24 years between his first victory in the cup and his 1959 triumph. And I suppose really what I'm drawing from that, as far as to look at the bigger picture, is that Billy Walker did really well to keep abreast of developments, because the 1950s are a period in which developments are legion. Bear in mind that Billy Walker first plays for Aston Villa before the third back, before the offside rule is changed, which is in the mid-20s, isn't it? And he manages to retain his remarkable goal scoring record. But by the time we get to 1959, the game has changed out of all recognition. We no longer have two fullbacks, as it was when he started. We now have back fours, as Brazil have pioneered, and a little bit, I think, the Hungarians. We now no longer have blunderbuss centre forwards. We have deep lying centre forwards who play with subtlety from midfield. and get moves going from the centre circle. So the game has changed a huge amount, and I think it's become much more flexible and requires, quite different sort of mental and indeed physical uh, characteristics. But at the same time, Billy Walker is still lifting the cup, and I think that's some achievement. So he is definitely somebody that I think would deserves to be remembered for just, if only for the narrative, for the story that that goes with him. Now, we were talking
But you're
earlier
right. I mean,
about,
it is an absolutely remarkable gap in time. I mean, even forgetting the the gap from when he's won it as a player, which is amazing. But between cup wins as manager is really phenomenal.
it means he's completely across this sort of tactical side of the game, even
Yeah,
as the tactical side of the game is changing and creating new challenges and so forth. So he is an impressive character and well worth remembering. Now, we was talking about how far top players become top managers, and
mm,
I think we naturally assume that when somebody like Wayne Rooney retires, that he'll be given a chance behind the managerial desk, and or Lampard or Gerrard, these types of players automatically seem to slip into managerial hot seats quite routinely. But it doesn't always work out that well. And actually, it's interesting to note that neither Rooney nor Gerrard nor Lampard is playing in the top division, is managing in the top division at the moment. And maybe they won't again, but we'll see. But the question I had to
mm.
ask, which we were discussing earlier in the week, was this question of when is the last time that the top division in England, that the manager was of the team that won the title, was an England international. So in other words, we're really asking about the Alf Ramsey experience. Alf Ramsey played 33 times for England as a player, and then he becomes a manager of Ipswich. And in 1962, he lifts the title. So he's both an outstanding player, England international, and a title-winning manager. When's the last time that someone did what Alf Ramsey did? And perhaps I don't know if our viewer has managed to puzzle this one out yet, but perhaps you could take us through what the answer is, and then we'll go to another question about
Yeah.
management
Well, when
transfers.
you, when you asked me that question, I must confess I made hard work of it. I got there in the end. But the most recent example is Brian Clough, who won a couple of England caps back in the day, but then went on to win the league with Derby and then more latterly with Nottingham Forest. So well done to anybody who's got that question right, and maybe anybody who made lighter work of it than I managed.
It's curious because, of course, famously, no English manager has won the league since Howard Wilkinson. You go back to 1991.
Yes.
So we can lop off the first 30 years of our as we work backwards through this. In fact,
Mm,
ironically, perhaps the best managers of the last 30 years have all been quite modest as players. Ferguson more or less held down a first team place at Rangers, but didn't win
mm,
a Scotland cap as such. He goes on a Scotland tour of Australia, but it's a sort of
mm.
Scotland 11 he plays for. But he's not.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he'd be the first to admit he didn't tear up any uh, exciting as a player.
Mm,
And then you have and of course at the same time we've had Mourinho, who's a modest player, I think it's fair to say, but Benitez, who was extremely modest. Actually, Benitez hardly had a playing career at all, and Mourinho and Wenger. These have been the top managers. Now these are not great players by any means. So now we're back into the 1990s and into the 1980s, and you mentioned Howard Kendall from the 1980s, who was an
yes.
England under 23 player, I think, but didn't
Yeah.
ever get his cap. And
Yeah. I think he's somebody who, from what I can gather, he'd be held up, I think, as one of the best English players to not get a cap.
yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think that's right.
He
Yeah,
was
along with Steve Bruce and so forth. A lot
he,
of
I think he was a very good player, but
Oh, he was.
there were a lot of other good midfielders around at the time.
He was extremely um, he was extremely promising. Don't forget, he played an FA Cup final aged 18. So, quite a huge achievement. So we're running out of time a little bit here, Carl. So let's quickly cut to the chase. Can you help us? Which English managers, so managers of English teams, broke the
Mm.
record for transfer fees in the 1940s and 50s. Which managers were entrusted with the big money as far as
Well,
building a team is concerned?
well, there was a club that was nicknamed the Bank of England Club
Yes, you're absolutely
back
right. Very
in the
good.
day, which was Sunderland.
Indeed, it was.
Uh, and their manager, I believe, was Bill Murray.
Very good. Very good.
Um, and so they I think they broke the record more than once. I mean,
You're right.
Shackleton, for example, cost a lot of money.
Yes.
Um, and I think they were something. It's something we've talked about before, that there were controversies around whether they played a bit fast and loose with the rules
Yes.
in terms of under the counter payments, because of course this was the days of the maximum
Yes.
wage. But they certainly paid big transfer fees.
They did.
So
They did.
that's Sunderland.
Yeah,
Um,
that's very good. That's a
but I
very good
must admit,
shout. So that we're
I
talking there
can't
about we're talking
think
there.
really who else really stands out. Um, I mean, Manchester United had the odds big transfer fee, like for example, Tommy Taylor, that they paid a fair amount for. Um, but yeah, I can't think of anybody else who was quite like Sunderland.
No, I've got to take my hat off for Bill Murray of Sunderland because that's a very good shout. And you're right, it was Len Shackleton who was 20 grand, and then Trevor Ford who was
Trevor Ford,
30
that's right.
grand.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
And so these two huge buys, which um, the idea
And
was
they infamously didn't get on. Apparently,
no, I didn't
didn't
get
they?
on.
Ford and
No.
Shackleton.
They
Ah,
were bought to score the goals, and as always, Carl, it's goal scorers that go for the big money. They were
yes.
bought to score the goals, and they may have scored some goals, but they didn't get on. And Trevor Ford then leaves for where does he? I don't know where he goes after Sunderland, but anyway, that his days at
Mm.
Sunderland are over. Yeah, well, very good indeed. The other manager who is perhaps more surprising is Stuart McMillan, who twice breaks the record. And I wonder if you know, where was Stuart McMillan manager? He's quite an he's in the 40s we're talking
Mm.
about now, so he's going right back into he's manager of Derby, and
Ah,
he buys a brilliant
he bought a
central.
Scottish.
Go
He
on.
bought a Scottish player, didn't he?
He did indeed.
Uh,
Who is that?
just
A
just
brilliant,
after the war,
yes, a brilliant
uh,
midfielder.
inside forward.
That's right. Yeah, Billy
Uh,
Steele.
Billy Steele,
And
thank
he is a
you.
brilliant player, isn't he? We see him
Yeah,
in the Scotland and England games. He's very
yeah.
impressive. And he buys another uh, top draw.
Oh, now there was they made a big signing from Manchester United, didn't they?
They
He
did.
bought John Morris,
That's right, exactly who they bought. Yeah, very good.
who Busby didn't really want to sell,
Right.
but apparently, I think, mm, whether I'm assuming this was a bluff, but Morris threatened Busby that he would simply retire from football and become a professional golfer.
I think you're right.
And because Morris said that, Busby didn't want to take the risk
No.
of losing him for nothing,
Yeah, yeah.
and so United sold Morris to Derby,
He did.
much against Busby's wishes, really.
Right. Right.
But I thought it was a wonderful story. The idea that a player might retire to take up golf, as a threat to avoid his club not getting a transfer fee.
You know,
That's
one of the features of the 1950s is that the players had so little power, they would try anything they could. And of course, at the same time, Charlie Mitten, another of Busby's
yes.
initial 1948 side, the great 1948 side that kept coming second in the league until they eventually won it in 52. Charlie Mitten, he found his own way of escaping from the
The
fight,
Bogota Bandit.
and went off to Colombia to play.
Yes.
It didn't last very long then, nor did anybody, but he was that was his answer to this situation. So one way or another, the players found ways of coping with the situation they were in, and um, so yeah, well, that's very good going. I didn't expect you to get those two, but you basically I
I got,
give
well,
you
I got
that.
I got
Well,
one.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You knew your the story of Stuart McMillan and Derby County. Well, that's all we've got time for this time. So thanks very much, Carl, and we'll
Thank you, Peter.
hopefully see you one and all again next time. Bye bye.
Bye.